So far, I've been talking an awful lot about preparing, thinking it through, getting ideas down. It seems an awful lot of this has been about trying to work out plans and strategies and all this. I'm going to emphasize that, yep, it has been, because that's the bit people often forget, but you do need to get started. You need to actually get going. And doing that, there's just a couple of little tips that I'd give early on about setting up and getting going. The first one is so boring, but I can't advise enough that it's definitely worth going through, which is get yourself set up properly. So I have no great joy in constitutions. I've spent much of my life messing about with constitutions and remits and rules and all that kind of stuff. And that's not because I have any great joy from it. It's because I get less joy from crises, disasters, errors which you're not equipped to deal with. So having all the structures, rules, guidelines, remit, having that all in place early on, it doesn't actually help you much when things are going well. But if something goes wrong, if you get any problems, it becomes absolutely vital. Now, this is especially the case if you're dealing with money. If you're fundraising, community, public, crowdfunding or whatever, then you're instantly vulnerable if there's any hint of impropriety about how that money's been used or how it's been managed. Now, don't get too lost in this. You do not need to get into really complex, detailed processes of constitution building, model constitutions that are 20 pages long. You don't have to set up limited companies. You might, but you don't have to set up limited companies. Just make sure that you've got the basics set down. So for example, what are you like if you've got a campaign going, just be absolutely clear from the very beginning what you're allowed to spend money on. So set out your campaign goals and you can just say anything that works towards these. You might want to, especially if you're voluntary, just rule out things. So, seriously, don't take folk for dinner on campaign money as a general rule. But, if you've got to organise meetings, a coffee. Paying for a coffee if you want to meet somebody. A politician will always pay, journalists will probably always pay. But if you want to do meetings with people, you might want to spend a little bit on a coffee. The point is, decide in advance what you're going to spend money on. Don't wait until someone says, wait a minute, here, how's there a 20 quid bill for Starbucks? What are we doing in Starbucks? Decide it in advance. It just saves you difficulties. If you're going to have money, particularly if it's significant amounts of money, it really is useful to have a treasurer, someone taking a treasurer's position. Now again, you can find lots of information about the duties and expectations of a treasurer. It's not a legal formal duty necessarily. It's just something along the lines of mark where all the money comes in from, mark where all the money goes out to, keep all the receipts and make sure that if money goes out or there's a receipt and you're not clear what it's for or why, that you just ask so that you know. Just little things like this. Have a think about just little basic housekeeping things like, what happens if two people in the steering committee fall out? What happens if the steering committee is divided and it can't make a decision? Are you going to have majority votes? Are you going to work by consensus? Again, just to make sure that everybody understands how it's going to work. What happens if somebody breaks the rules? What happens if somebody does something which is damaging to the reputation of the group? So what happens if somebody gets carried away and gets in a screaming, shouting match and it's inappropriate and it causes a complaint or something like that? What would you do then? Are you going to throw people out the group? If you make these things up as you go along, it's just harder. It just causes more problems. It can cause serious ill feeling inside the group. I've seen campaigns fall apart because of these kind of unmanaged personality clashes. But at its worst, it can just make you look like you're in disarray. What you do not want is a newspaper story which says such and such campaign at each other's throats, missing money, blah, blah, blah. So The more, and incidentally, the more radical your campaign, the more that what you are doing might be considered to be controversial, the more important it is that you're got your back covered. So just don't get carried away with this. Just get yourself set up in a way that obviously predictable problems that might come along internally with how you're running the show are just covered so that you don't have to fight these fights as you go through it. So before you get started, do that. And then just make sure that everybody, if there are separate roles, if there are different things going on, just make sure that everybody in your group understands it. So it can, again, it can cause all kinds of unnecessary ill feeling if one person thinks that they're in charge of the money and somebody else doesn't hand money over or whatever. Or if you've got two people who both think they're your spokesperson, you can have difficulties with that. So just make sure that everybody understands the rules, the roles. Most of the time, particularly with community campaigns, these will bleed over into each other. But if you're going into a slightly more formal campaign, then yeah, you might want to actually say, okay, wait a minute, this is our spokesperson, and this is the person that deals with media inquiries, and this is the person who is going to talk to the politicians. You might want to have a more formal role in that. If you're getting into that territory of the slightly more formal campaign, and again, particularly if there's money involved, or particularly if you have any liability risk, you might want to think at that point about setting up a small limited company. It's fairly straightforward. But if you do it like that, it does cause you more work and ongoing work, because you then do need to behave as if you're running a limited company. But what it does is it does help you with liability problems. So if you ran a campaign and it had major money problems, or there was anything that happened that caused financial liability, you've got the protection of a small limited company or a Scottish Community Interest Organisation, a SIO. You can set those up as well. There's a number of forms that you can do this. If you want to get advice on how you can go about doing that, there are lots of resources online. The Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations has quite a lot of material on the structures of campaign voluntary organisations and how they might work. So just do a bit of housekeeping earlier on. With a bit of luck, it'll turn out to have not been necessary. But if things go a little bit wrong, if you've got any problems, it's just good to have that there to fall back on, and you know that you're well structured. And then, again, you can make mistakes by going off half-cocked and not ready, but then again, you've got to get going sometime. So what does that mean? Could be all sorts of things. If it's a small campaign, if it's a community campaign, a good starting point might be a public meeting, just to find out. It helps you to gather more people and find out if there's more folk that are interested in this, if the support's there, and you can get going with a public meeting. If you are a more formal campaign, or you're running a specific campaign, so you can be an organisation that's running a campaign, so you can be an organisation that's running a fundraising campaign, you'll want a launch. If you're a new organisation, you'll want a launch. You'll want some kind of event to say, hello, we're here. If you're trying to shift legislation, you might want to launch, might want to kick off with a combination between information and awareness raising. What are we about? What are we trying to achieve, and why are we doing it? What's the problem we're trying to solve, or the harm we're trying to prevent? So you might start off with a news story which is specifically geared to getting people aware that there's a problem. And remember, a lot of times in communities, it's easy to over-assume that everybody else in the community knows this thing is happening. It's quite easy for people in your community to not be aware there's a proposal for an incinerator. So your first step might not be a public meeting. Your first step might be putting letters or leaflets through doors, just saying, did you know they're building an incinerator next door? So think about how you get started. Think about the first thing that you're going to do and what you want to do with it, but get on with it. Get it done. And don't worry too much, because for a lot of community campaigns, you will be feeling your way as you go along. You probably won't have done all the things that I've been talking about throughout this series of videos, and you probably will just start with the public meeting and take it from there. Yep, you might not do the things that, you know, there's 8 parts in this series. You very possibly may not do them in order. You might very possibly find yourself, we've got to get started, we've got to have the public meeting. Right, we've done it, there is the interest. How are we going to develop a strategy? What is it we're exactly asking for? You've got to get started. And once you get started, your campaign has a momentum of itself. It actually all becomes easier. Once you get going, at first, it becomes quite clear the things you need to do. The stuff that the early stages of a campaign will usually open up in front of you, and it becomes quite obvious what the next things that you've got to do are, but only if you get started. Don't plan forever. You can't navel gaze your way into success. So just do a little bit of housekeeping and then get going. For each of the short videos in this course on how to build up a campaign, you'll find on the Commonweal's Campaign Centre there is a little worksheet which will recap the things we've just talked about, will give you the key learning points that you need to remember, and it'll give you a couple of little exercises that you can try out to put these skills into practice for real. If you go to Commonweal's Campaign Centre, you'll find all the materials there. Give them a shot, see how you get on with them, and if you've got questions, don't hesitate to drop an email, or better still, put a message into Campaign Centre. There'll be lots of other people with campaign experience who are there and who want to help you develop and build your skills.